In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make pie crust. Now, I realize this can be an intimidating thing for many people, but once you get the basic technique down, I think it is a pretty easy thing to do, and it adds a nice extra touch to your pie because, in my opinion, I think the pie crust makes or breaks a pie. So hopefully you won't be so as intimidated after you watch this video. I've used a lot of different recipes throughout my experience in making pies, but the one that I like the most is a flaky pastry dough crust from the Joy of Cooking cookbook. So that's the one I'm going to use today. You start with 2.5 cups of flour, and I just use all-purpose flour. I have made a cornmeal crust before, and I really like that as well, and you just substitute some cornmeal for the flour. But I'm using 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. There's a teaspoon of sugar and a teaspoon of salt in there right now, and I've blended it using a pastry blender. You could also use a food processor or even just a fork. Now, I do prefer blending the crust by hand. If you use a food processor, I think it makes the butter creamier, and so the dough or the pastry isn't as flaky. So I prefer doing it by hand, and I just think that the pastry blender is easier to use than the fork. This isn't a whisk. The edges are a little bit sharper, so it's called a pastry blender if you're interested in getting one. So to that, I've combined, as I said, the flour, sugar, and salt, and to that you add 2 sticks or 1/2 pound of butter, and this is unsalted butter. And as you can see, I've cut it into little cubes, and that'll make it easier to blend. Now, it's important that your butter is very cold. This will just help with the blending. You don't want to melt it, and you don't want it to be, again, creamy in there. You want it to form little pieces. So you take the pastry blender and just start working it. Now, I use, as I said, this is 2 sticks of butter, but to this you will add some vegetable shortening. And I realize that is a trans fat, but in my opinion, I think it's best when you add a little bit of the shortening in with it. It just helps with the texture. I've used all butter before, and it makes it too buttery and a little bit oily. So again, I prefer that combination of butter and shortening. And you do have to put a little bit of arm strength into this. And the goal is to get the consistency to a pea-size shape pieces in there. That's a little bit big, so I'm going to work at this a little bit longer until it's pea size. So now, as you can see, I've used the pastry blender to cut in the butter, and I added that 1/4 cup of vegetable shortening into here, and the goal is to make it like pea-size pieces. I know it might be difficult to see, but it's not an exact science, but as you can see, there's still some loose flour in there, but for the most part, it's pea-size pieces of butter in there. So to this, I'm going to add 1/3 cup plus 1 tablespoon of ice water. And now I like to reserve a little bit of it because it's easier to add more water than it is to take it away, obviously. And it's important to use ice water, again, because the coldness, like the butter and the water, it just helps with the consistency of the pastry. So I'm going to add the 1/3 cup plus 1 tablespoon of ice water, again, just reserving a little bit of it. And I'll add it if I need it. So again, using the pastry blender, just working that in. And one of the keys with pastry is not overworking it, because that will prevent it from being flaky. So I'm just going to do this until the pieces are just sticking together. And it's not very long. As you can see, it easily gets stuck on this. And then at the very end, I just use my hands. And all of this just sticks together. And again, you don't want to work it very much. And you do that until it's a ball. So I did end up adding just a little bit more of the water, maybe 1 more tablespoon. And this is where kind of the art of pastry comes into play. It's just by feel and by experience that you know how much water to add. You don't want it to be too wet, but wet enough that all the pieces stay together. So I didn't pack it completely again, because you don't want to pack it. You want the pastry to be flaky. But I wanted to just show you kind of how I do it. And as you can see, your hands get kind of messy doing it. So from here, when it's nearly a complete ball, I transfer it to a floured surface. And then I add the rest of the dough here. And I hadn't mentioned before, but this recipe makes 2 crusts. So if you're doing a crust with a top to it, that's how it would make enough for that. So then I just kind of, not really knead it, but just kind of make sure all the pieces stay together. So there's a few little crumbs, but for the most part, that's what you end up with. And so again, this ball would make 2 separate crusts. So I would divide this in half and then roll out each half, making the bottom and the top crust of the pie. So now I've taken half of the amount of the batch of dough that I made, and we're going to roll it out for the bottom of the pie crust. And I have prepared a 9, or you could even use 10-inch pie plate that is greased, just to make sure that the pastry doesn't stick to it. You would think 2 sticks of butter and it wouldn't stick, but sometimes it sticks. So I have a floured surface and a rolling pin, and I'm just going to start rolling this out. And I just kind of pat it down and I flip it over so that it doesn't stick. You want to make sure that there's flour beneath it. And you start rolling. And this is kind of where crust can get a little bit intimidating, because you don't want to work it too much, but you have to be able to get it in the shape that you want and the thickness that you want. So you roll it out until it's about 1/4 inch thick. Now it's starting to stick, so I'm going to put more flour down to make sure it doesn't stick. Flip it over and just, you can patch those cracks that are happening. And I put a little flour on the top so it doesn't stick. And I'm never good about making the perfect circle, but that's okay as long as it fits in the pie plate. And again, there's a big crack, so I just kind of patch it together and keep rolling it until it is big enough to go into my pie plate, which again is about 1/4 inch thick. Alright, so I'll take my pie plate and I just kind of put it over. This side might not be long enough, so you can just patch it. It's probably not the way professionals do it. Maybe it is. I don't know. But that's the way I do it. And it makes it a little bit more even of a circle. And again, put the pie plate over and it looks like it's big enough. So now is another tricky spot, is when hopefully it didn't stick on the bottom. And if it did, you know what? You just roll it up into a ball again and re-roll it out. So I roll it up onto my rolling pin, take the pie plate, lift it up, again making sure it doesn't stick, and sliding it onto your pie plate. And gently allow it to fall, to touch the bottom and around on the sides. And now you're ready to fill your pie with whatever filling you have. So the final step to completing the pie, as you can see, I've put in my pie filling, and here I'm making apple pie. So it's basically cinnamon sugar apples with a little bit of flour mixed in and some pieces of butter, as if the crust didn't have enough butter. But you know, a little more butter isn't going to hurt anything. And then I've put the top layer on. I rolled out that second half of the pie dough that we made, roll it out the same way, and used the rolling pin to lay it over the top of the pie. So the last thing I'm going to do is flute the edges. At least I think that's what it's called. We're going to go with it. So to do that, there's a number of ways you can do it. You can use a fork, but I like to just use my fingers. And basically you're just crimping the edge of the pie. And you're going to go around the entire pie like that. And what that does is seal the top and the bottom crust together. Now if you were just doing a crust with a bottom and not a top, you would do the same thing. So you just crimp the edges here. And you go all the way around. And then to finish, as you can see there's crust hanging over here, I just take a knife and run it along the edge of my pie crust, or my pie pan. And then you can add some air holes to the top so that it doesn't explode and it allows the air to escape. But then, so you finish your pie crust.